Good morning, everyone, or good whatever time of day it is, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to UFAW's online animal welfare conference for 2023. My name's Huw Golledge. I'm Chief Exec of UFAW, and it's a pleasure to welcome over 400 delegates to this online meeting from 63 countries around the world. If you don't have the program in front of you, click on that link or the QR code, and you can look at the program to see what's coming up over the next couple of days. Before we start these meetings, it's customary that I spend a bit of time talking about UFAW and what we are, for those of you who don't know. If you do know, feel free to go and make a cup of coffee for 5 minutes, but I always think it's worth explaining a little bit about what UFAW is and why we run activities like this meeting. So UFAW, first and foremost, is a charity whose purpose is to promote science in the service of animal welfare. And we do that partly by being a membership organisation. Our vision is a world where the welfare of every animal affected by humans is maximised through a scientific understanding of their needs and how to meet them. And the way we try and achieve that is to discover what matters to animals, develop solutions to animal welfare problems, and disseminate evidence-based animal welfare information, which is what we're doing today. But the first two of those mission statements we support through things like trying to support scientific research and development through research grants and other activities to find out what matters to animals or how to solve animal welfare problems. And we also try to support the careers of the people who do that research and who implement those solutions, because we understand how difficult it can be to establish a career in animal welfare science. So we have programs like student scholarships for students to do their first animal welfare research, and mentoring programs to try and support people who are working in animal welfare science. Dissemination wise, as well as conferences, we publish a scientific journal, Animal Welfare, and a book series, and we also publish lots of information on the web and so on to try and get the message about animal welfare science in front of the people who can use it to make real world improvements to animal welfare. Our research support is something some of you may well be interested in. We do provide grants for a whole range of animal welfare research, from very small sort of seed corn funding up to more significant amounts of money. If you go to ufaw.org.uk/grants, you can see all the research that we funded over recent years and find out how you can apply for one of our grants. Our student scholarships are awards for undergraduates, usually to do their first piece of research into animal welfare. They've been a real springboard for lots of people into careers both in animal welfare research or into policy and government and regulation of animal welfare. They're a really great opportunity both for the students and also for supervisors to get their students doing projects in their vacations typically. And most recently we've launched a scheme to mentor the students who do those projects, and that's been a really valuable scheme both for the students who are mentored but also for the early career researchers who act as mentors and get quite often their first experience of supervising or mentoring a younger researcher. And we'll be putting out our call for both mentors and mentees for that scheme fairly soon, later this summer. So do keep an eye out for that if you might be interested in participating in that. Our journal, Animal Welfare, is something we're very proud of. It's the longest continuously published animal welfare journal, founded in 1992. Last year, or on the 1st of January this year, in fact, the journal went fully gold open access, which means that absolutely everything we publish is open access on the web through our partnership with Cambridge University Press, which we think is really important, that particularly animal welfare science, of all the sciences, needs to be open access so that people who can make policy changes or change their practice of the way they interact with animals can read the information without it being hidden behind a paywall. We do charge an article processing charge for publishing in the journal, but we have a really extensive waiver program which should ensure that absolutely anyone who needs to publish something in animal welfare won't find the article processing charge to be a barrier to publication. And do have a look at the website, which explains how you can apply for a waiver. Again, we're really keen that anyone who's got good science can publish it in animal welfare, and the only barrier should be the quality of the science. So do go and have a look at the journal. We'd love to see lots of the really interesting new research which is being presented over the next couple of days, published in animal welfare. We also publish a book series in collaboration with Wiley-Blackwell. Hopefully lots of you will know some of the more well-known books in the series. I just wanted to highlight a couple of upcoming ones which might be of interest. First of all, Wildlife Ethics, the Ethics of Wildlife Management and Conservation by Claire Palmer and colleagues is coming out in September, and it's one of the first comprehensive overviews of the ethics of wildlife management and conservation, something that's really come to prominence over recent years. And one of the co-authors, Jordan Hampton, is the winner of our Early Career Researcher of the Year award this year, and also presenting at this conference. Another upcoming book that lots of you will know is David Fraser's Understanding Animal Welfare. It's the book that I turned to when I got into animal welfare science, and David has recently comprehensively updated it, and it will be coming out in its second edition, hopefully later this year. As part of this conference, if you want to buy any of those books from wiley.com, if you use the code VET20, VET20, they'll give you 20% off. But I should point out that if you join UFAW, you can have 35% discount. So there's a good incentive to become a member of UFAW. So that's a real quick lightning overview of UFAW and what we do. Everything we do is funded by donations and legacies from people who support us and our members paying their membership fees. So if you haven't, please do consider becoming a member or perhaps even supporting our work. But particularly for the audience today who are animal welfare scientists, we'd really like you to be a member of UFAW. This should be your society as animal welfare scientists. So do have a look at the link and consider joining if you aren't a member. And also, please do make sure you stay in touch with what we do. We're about to launch a new electronic newsletter. And if you go to ufaw.org.uk/sign up or click the QR code, you can sign up to be on that mailing list, which will make sure you hear about all the activities we're up to and research funding opportunities and so on. So please do sign up if you're not already signed up or not already a member of UFAW. And finally, just to say, we are already thinking about next year's conference, even though we haven't done this year's yet. There will be a UFAW 2024, and it will be a hybrid conference, both online and in person, somewhere in Europe, all being well. We're just sorting out a few of the usual Brexit-related dramas of being a UK organisation trying to carry out activities in Europe. But we will be announcing a venue for that conference around about this time next year, somewhere in Europe. So we hope to see you next year. The long-term plan is that we do an online conference, and every other year we'll do a hybrid online and in person. So we'll reduce our carbon footprint a little bit, but give people the opportunity to get together in person every other year if they want to. So with all that said, I just need to go through the practicalities of an online meeting. So at least I don't have to tell you where the fire exit is, but I do have to tell you a few bits and bobs about this meeting. You've obviously found your way into the meeting using the login link that we sent you. There are 8 sessions over the 2 days, and for each session, you'll need to use that same link to log in again. So we'll close each session when there's a break, just to allow us to save the recordings. So just use the same link to log in when the next session starts. The sessions are being recorded and they'll be available to view on our YouTube channel once we get them edited. Please use the hashtag UFAW 2023 if you're tweeting. We'd love you to tweet about it. I know lots of you are really great at summarizing all the science that's being talked about, so do tweet. And once again, there's the link to the program if you don't have it in front of you. Hopefully you're seeing something like this at the moment, although you may be seeing the GoToWebinar app instead. Either way, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. You can see a question box on this browser window where you can ask questions of all the speakers. The talks are mainly recorded, so we'll be playing recordings, but all the speakers should be here live to answer questions after their talk. So please do put your questions in the box and we'll pick out as many as we can to put to the speakers. If you're in the GoToWebinar app, it might look more like this, but again, there's a question box down at the bottom there where you can post your questions. And please try and put them in there rather than the chat box if possible. Alongside the talks, there's a poster exhibition to go with this conference. All the abstracts for the posters are in the program booklet. So if you scroll to the end of the program booklet, you can see all the abstracts for the posters. And there's a link down at the bottom of the abstract which says go to poster. If you click on that, it'll take you to Dropbox where you can view all the posters. And if you'd like to comment or ask a question on a poster, you can go to our special Slack channel that we've set up for this by clicking on the link, going to the section relevant to that poster, and then if you stick the name of the first author in there with an @ sign before it, you'll be able to post a question to them about the poster. So do go and have a look at the posters in the breaks or after we finish tonight and ask some questions, because I know the authors are very keen to talk about their work in the poster exhibition as well. This is what today looks like. So we've got 4 sessions today with breaks in between. As I say, log back in after each break. We've got different chairs for each session. So thanks to everyone who's volunteered to chair a session. And tomorrow is much the same plan, but please note that we start much earlier at 8 AM tomorrow. And that's not just to confuse folk. It's to try and be a bit more accommodating for people who are on different time zones. So you'll notice in the first session tomorrow, it's a very Antipodean, Southeast Asian group of authors, because it's a much more amenable time for them to present early in the morning. And later on in the day, there's an American-Canadian focus when it becomes much better suited to their time zones. So that's our best attempt at making these conferences a little bit more friendly to our friends who are not on a European time zone. Hopefully we'll run another meeting sometime in a year or so, or on a different time zone for our friends in Southeast Asia and Australasia like we did last year. But for today, just note the early start for day 2 at 8 o'clock tomorrow. Just a couple of quick plugs for some highlights of the conference. The main focus is on submitted abstracts, which we reviewed blind and selected the best ones to form the bulk of the conference. But we've got a couple of invited keynote talks as well. Today, Beth Ventura talking about animal welfare. The elephant in the room is us, looking perhaps at how we translate some of the science into real world changes. That's a really intriguing talk that I'm looking forward to today. And tomorrow, Lars Chitka will be talking about his work on bee sentience or bee cognition, and what that might mean for how we think about the welfare of bees and perhaps even insects more generally, which I think will be fascinating too. We also have presentations from our UFAW award winners. So later today, we'll be presenting the UFAW medal to Per Jensen for outstanding contributions to animal welfare science. And then he'll be talking about his work. And we'll also be presenting awards for 2 early career researchers of the year, Sarah Hitzer and Jordan Hampton. And they'll be presenting their work at various times tomorrow. And just while we're on the subject of these medals and awards, these are ways that UFAW recognises people who've made real major contributions to animal welfare science, or starting out on a career where they'll be making those contributions in future, no doubt. And we'll be launching the call for these awards in the autumn again. So do have a look at the web pages, ufaw.org.uk/medal or ECR, if you'd like to nominate one of your colleagues who you think deserves one of these awards next year, or even if you'd like to nominate yourself. So before we start properly, the one last thing I have to do in case I forget later is to thank all the people who make this meeting happen, which is not least, of course, everyone who submitted their abstracts as speakers or poster presenters, everyone who volunteered to chair a session for us, everyone who's just registered to come along and be part of the meeting today. That's the most important part. But also the staff at UFAW who make it happen in the background. There's a huge effort goes into this over at least a year to put these meetings together from various people at UFAW who are making sure that you can register for these meetings and that we've got a really professional program put together for you. And not least, I need to thank Steve Wickens, who is running all the technology in the background, who lots of you will have met doing a run through of your talks or working out problems with registration. Steve really puts a huge amount of effort into these meetings. So huge thanks to Steve, who is tirelessly working away in the background. So one last thing to say, if you've got any comments or questions or technical problems, you can email us at events@ufaw.org.uk. And at the end, we will be asking you to fill out a post-conference survey just to tell us how you think it went and if there's anything we could do better. So please do fill that out. It's really helpful for us. So without further ado, I'm afraid you're stuck with me as session chair for the first session today. So I will go straight into the session today and introduce our first talk, which is from Vivian Goerlich from Utrecht in the Netherlands, talking about a dynamic concept of animal welfare based on the animal's ability to adapt.
Hello everyone, thanks for joining, and of course many thanks to Stephen and the UFAW Organizing Committee for giving me an opportunity to present our work today. We're all here with a common interest to better understand animal welfare. Still, we might have slightly different ideas on how to define welfare. And therefore, we need concepts to set a framework and also guide us in the assessment, promotion, and safeguarding of animal welfare, animals in all kinds of contexts. We live in a dynamic world, we're exposed to changes constantly, and so we also think that the approach to welfare should be a dynamic one. And last year, together with my colleagues Saskia Arndt and Franz Josef van der Stey, we published our suggestion for a dynamic concept of animal welfare. We build up on the existing framework. Shortly gonna highlight some concepts. Of course, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but we know the 5 freedoms which really set a start in the assessment of welfare, focusing mostly on the absence of negative states. We moved on to quality of life, emphasizing the subjective experience of the individual and emphasizing also the importance of positive welfare and positive experiences. The concept of allostasis realizes that stability is achieved through change and reacting to these dynamic environmental challenges. And they're also stating that if these challenges are of high impact or long-lasting, they might exceed the capacity of an animal to adapt to these, and an individual might reach a state of allostatic overload with negative consequences. In the welfare assessment, the 5 domains have really set also the framework, describing the interactions between environmental factors such as husbandry and social behavior, and finally these aspects together influencing the mental state of the animal. And we build up also on, so to say, version 1 of the dynamic concept, which described welfare as a function of adaptation. In this figure, we try to depict the basis of our concept, namely also the interplay between external factors and internal factors. Both of these can reach from positive, so highly advantageous, to negative, highly disadvantageous. And an animal's welfare state is determined by an interplay of these two factors. And so an animal can reside in a state of unimpaired welfare here in green. If one of these factors is more challenging, reaching a negative connotation, an animal might move towards its limit of adaptability, so here in blue. And if this is exceeded because one of internal or external conditions are highly negative, an animal will reside in an impaired welfare state. And we say that the better the animal's condition and the more advantageous the environment, the more likely the animal is able to cope and adapt to both of these conditions. And here our concept in writing. So we state that an individual is likely in a positive welfare state when it is mentally and physically capable and possesses the ability and opportunity to react adequately to internal and external conditions. So we refer to capacities as innate or inherited repertoire determined by its genetics or even epigenetics, and abilities as learned or acquired traits. Opportunities are determined by husbandry and management in the case of captive animals, for example, adequate housing. And here's some more examples. So if we think about an individual being mentally and physically capable, well, we know the examples of brachycephalic dogs, which are by their morphology already restricted in their ability to adapt to many challenges. So this animal resides, you could say, already in a state of diminished welfare. Another example would be animals which acquire illnesses or diseases due to wrong husbandry. Here in this example, the litter might have been the wrong type or hygiene not good enough. And finally, on the right, might remind you of the Netherlands, a romantic picture of cows on a meadow, but if you look closer, there's actually no opportunity to seek shadow, so the animal is restricted in its ability to adapt to changes in temperature. We see also that humans have a duty of care to provide the opportunities to animals so they can fulfill their needs. And speaking about needs, behavioral needs, coping and adaptation are another important element of our concept, because we state that adequate reactions are elements of an animal's normal behavior. They allow the animal to cope with and adapt to the demands of the environmental circumstances. So here we emphasize the role of behavior in adapting, and natural behaviors such as dust bathing in chicken, rooting in pigs, or suckling behavior in maternal care are behaviors that animals are highly motivated to perform, and they help them to adapt to their environment. But we chose the term normal behavior actually because for domesticated animals, it might be difficult to define what natural behavior really is, because often ancestors are taken as set point, but think of ancestor of cattle, the other ox is extinct, or in other species or breeds, certain parts of behavior might have been selected against. Think of brooding behavior in hens or aggression in companion animals. So it's rather tricky to define what natural is, so we chose the term normal. Normal is based on the knowledge of the animal or the breed, what is expected in the conditions, or maybe also on an individual level, what behavior repertoire does it show and are there changes. Coping and adaptation we describe as coping as a short-term response. So think of acute stressors a visit to a veterinarian, or a short intervention. Can the animal cope with that and again reach baseline after a stressor? Whereas adaptation describes more the long-term processes. So can an animal adapt to, for example, the husbandry and management procedures, which might be not the case in certain breeds. Think of laboratory mice, which are bred for very high anxiety traits, which cannot adapt to changes in cannot adequately adapt to changes in their environment. Finally, we of course also incorporate the mental aspect in our concept. So the coping and adaptation through behavior enables the individual to reach a state that it perceives as positive and that evokes positive emotions. So while we cannot measure emotions directly, at least at a certain time point, we emphasize also here the importance of behavior as a readout parameter to assess the mental state of an animal, and ideally behavioral measurements are supported by physiological proxies, and while morphological measures help, of course, assessing the current health state also of the animal, which we find good health as an important prerequisite for welfare, while emphasizing that good health does not automatically equal good welfare and vice versa. Whereas we emphasize the importance of positive emotions, we also emphasize that both negative and positive emotions have an important role in adaptation and coping, because this is a way to cope with a challenge. So, for example, aggressive behavior, fear behavior is in the long term positive for the animal because it's its reaction to the environment. So the important thing is, will it be able to adapt, or will these behaviors reach a maladaptive state over time? So ideally, again, here also husbandry gives the animals to perform the opportunities to perform these behaviors. I already mentioned we need to look over time because adaptation and coping is not a short-term process. So this is what we also emphasize in the dynamic concept, that welfare is a dynamic and continuous interplay between negative and positive emotions and acute welfare states. We need a long-term assessment of welfare because an animal at one snapshot measurement, like here the example of animal D, might be in a state of severely compromised welfare through external or internal intervention. Think of changes in husbandry, or think of a medication treatment of an illness. This animal might be able even to adapt and cope again and reach again a positive state over time. So it's really we need to look at welfare in a holistic way and across lifetime, which this long-term assessment comes with its challenges, of course, itself, because we are not sure yet how internal and external factors interplay. Yes, we suggest this graphical representation, but this is, of course, an arbitrary one. The limit of adaptability is dynamic. Patterns might look differently. So this is the call for future research to fill in this theoretical concept or figure. We don't know yet how lifetime events carry over. Think of the prenatal stress shaping an individual. There are studies showing the positive consequences thereof. Think of an animal being born into a environment with a lot of predation, maybe experience prenatal stress, but then by being more cautious or fearful, actually has an advantage in such an environment. But also think of studies where prenatal stress may lead to maladaptive behavior later in life and non-adequate coping with future stressors. Another question, of course, that remains is how do these different welfare states accumulate over lifetime? What are the net effects? Do they equal each other out? What we do propose is that the potential of positive factors to ameliorate welfare is higher than just the removal of negative factors. So adding positive experiences has probably more impact than just removing negative experiences. Yeah, and with that, I'm getting to the end of this talk. So to conclude, well, welfare is dynamic, and we describe that welfare is not the pure absence of negative or presence of positive states, but it is an interplay. And we need to look over time to better describe this continuum between the negative and positive welfare states. But to assess these welfare states and also lifetime welfare, we need a multidisciplinary approach, again emphasizing behavior as one of the most important readout parameters, but therefore we also need to know more about behavior. We need detailed ethograms, not looking only on a breed or species level, but even in details. And that's a challenge, looking also at individual behavioral repertoires, because then we can identify changes in these repertoires. We need to know more about the behavioral needs and motivations of animals and individuals, so we can fulfill these as much as possible. And therefore, yeah, we need the appropriate tools, sensors, and new technologies are, of course, promising, keeping in mind that in the end, it's a human factor deciding when welfare is compromised. And to safeguard and promote an individual's welfare, animal breeding and management should promote health and integrity. So mutilating procedures should be minimized as much as possible. We just showed that, for example, in cattle, horns might have a thermoregulatory function. So by removing horns, you might be diminishing the animal's ability to adapt to heat stress, for example. And husbandry should provide opportunities and choice for the animals to fulfill their behavioral needs, cope and adapt, and reach a positive state, as this is a basis to adaptive capacity. Yes, and with this, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Vivian. That was really interesting. If you could turn your camera on, I will pass on some of the questions. Hopefully you can hear me now, can you? I'm not sure we can hear you. There we go.
So it should work now. Yeah, I couldn't listen to my own talk. Maybe that's good.
As long as you can remember what you said, that's great. Thanks. So you talked a little bit there at the end about welfare over time and sort of cumulative effects. And I wondered, have you looked at the animal welfare assessment grid that Sarah Wolfenson and others have talked about? And I wondered how that related to your ideas.
Mm-hmm. Not now recently, but we are working also or looking at the pain tracks. I think tomorrow will be also a talk about that. So accumulation of pain across time, and that could be physiological, but also mental pain. And yeah, and so that the consequences, of course, can also change over time. So I mean, immediate response might be very or severely affecting the animal, and over time the consequences get less, but they are not yet gone. So taking the severity, the impact, but also over time into account. But it's a good tip. I write it down immediately, and we'll look at the assessment grid again. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a similar idea about tracking over time and also, I guess, looking at trends, whether it's worsening or improving, which is obviously important in some decision points. There's a question from Steve Wickens in the question box. The model displays severity of animal welfare as being the sum of external and internal factors. How are these weighed up against each other in practice?
Good question, very tricky. And yeah, like I think I said during the talk, it's a very simplified model, of course. So we also call for research to filling that in. And it will also, the scale and the interplay will, of course, depend on the individual again, and it will depend on its past experiences, current experiences, in interplay with the environment. A question I also got recently, are these on the same scale? So what am I comparing or summing up? I think these are the challenges we are facing now. Important to remember, because in the end we can only measure so much at on the animal, and in the end it's the human making a decision. This is severe according to what I was measuring, or internal factors are even, of course, even the internal state, very difficult to measure, but also you would need to take into account the whole genetic and epigenetic makeup of the animal. So it's not one straightforward question answer, I realize, but this is indeed a challenge. And even sometimes the distinction between internal and external is not that hard cut. So there I refer to the publication. There we have listed a table with examples of internal, external, positive and aversive factors. And happy to get more questions on that as well.
Yeah, that's a complicated one, but thank you. It's really challenging. One quick one from me, and then we better move on. But you talked about a sort of perennial question, which is how involved health is in welfare. Because it's if we take welfare as psychological well-being, it's possible for animals, including humans, to have very good psychological well-being, whereas an external observer would say that their health was extremely poor. So it's always quite a difficult circle to square that. I'm just interested in a bit more about what you thought about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, also this is an aspect we discuss a lot. Again, I would say it depends on the individual, because we know that's pain sensitivity and the perception of pain depends on individuals. In horses, I think it's been shown that even personality differs in the way they show pain. Again, we need to measure changes in behavior, or we have some physiological measures, but we never will be able, even with another human, to totally assess the pain. We say that health is a certain prerequisite, but does not equal, indeed, like you say, good welfare. Again, I would look at the combination also, in which environment is that animal kept? Does it have the resources to cope with this health issues it has? And yeah, then again, looking at the interplay, can I still safeguard the welfare? So it's also not a black and white or a certain or definite cutoff point. Of course, there are some health issues which are too severe. Then we talk about severity assessment as well, where welfare is definitely compromised. That I would say is.
Okay, thank you. Another one that's not an easy one to answer, but thanks, that's really interesting.
That's why we're here, for discussion.
Thank you. There are some more in the chat box. We'll keep track of those in case we can get you to answer them later, but thank you very much, Vivian.
Thank you.
So next up, we have a talk that you can see as being related, because it's recognizing facial expressions of negative emotional states in horses during the feeding period, from Claire Ricci-Bonot from the University of Lincoln.
Hi, I'm Claire Ricci-Bonot, a postdoc in the Animal Behavior Cognition and Welfare Department at the University of Lincoln, and today I will present you my research recognizing facial expression of negative emotional state in horses during the feeding period. In the past, researchers have been working mainly on the four first domains: nutrition, physical environment, health, and behavioral interaction. So in recent years, they have increasingly focused on the mental health of horses. So one potential way to assess emotional state in horses is to use their facial expression. In fact, horses are able to communicate with others thanks to subtle visual signals such as eye direction and ear position. Facial expression have been investigated in order to detect a pain in horses. In this research study, pain was induced in a different way, such as castration or was associated with acute colic, and the results show an alteration in facial expression induced by the pain, especially in the ears, eyes, and lower face area. So this study has thus made it possible to develop different scales for assessing pain in horses, as you can see here. Clearly, the face is a major source of emotional information. The facial action coding system, FACS, has been developed by Heckman and colleagues to facilitate the recording of facial expression based on the movement of underlying facial musculature. So this system has been developed in several species, such as cats, dogs, and several primates and horses. So for example, in horses, Ince and colleagues have proposed inner brow razor as indicator of emotional valence. So they tested the horses in 4 situations: grooming and food anticipation for positive emotional valence, and food competition and plastic bag for negative emotional valence. And the author found that the angle between the highest wrinkle and the line through the eyeball increased during food competition compared to control, whereas this angle decreased during grooming. An emotional reaction is an intense but short-lived affective response to a stimulus or event which is perceived as rewarding or punishing. Emotion can be characterized by 2 main dimensions: the valence, such as positive, pleasant, rewarding, versus negative, unpleasant, punishing, and the level of arousal or activation, such as high or low intensity. In this project, we investigated 3 emotions: the anticipation, the frustration, and the disappointment. For our research, we use an experimental paradigm from a previous study on dogs by Bremorts and colleagues. In their research, they examined dog facial expression during positive, anticipation of a food reward, and negative, denial access to the food reward context. And they found that dog facial expression differ with the context. However, facial emotional expression should not be generalized across species. Indeed, it has also been shown that anticipatory behavior can differ between species. The aim of this project was to distinguish the positive emotional facial expression of reward anticipation in the horse from negative ones when the food was not delivered as anticipated. So we hypothesized firstly that horse facial expression will differ between positive and negative valence, and secondly that they will also differ between the 2 negative emotional states, disappointment and frustration. For this experiment, we used 31 horses, 11 males and 20 females. They are 2 to 23-year-old, and they are from various breeds. We use a feeder with 2 panels, a transparent perpex panel, which closes the feeder, and an opaque panel located at the bottom of the feeder. So this feeder was attached to the outside of the loose box, along with a device to put the feed in. On the outside of the loose box, a device was installed with 2 screens allowing the experimenter to remain hidden during the test. From behind the screen on the left of the picture, the experimenter could manipulate the different panels, and behind the right screen, the other experimenter could fill the feeder. And 2 cameras were installed in front of the loose box to record during the test. The first step was to habituate the horses to the feeder. The horses were brought to the experimental loose box and encouraged to investigate the device. The second step was reward anticipation. When the horse was at less than 1 meter from the feeder, the experimenter poured food in it. The food was the usual pellet of the horses. After 10 seconds, the other experimenter slid the perpex panel to give the subject access to the food. And this contact was repeated on multiple occasions in order that the horse learned to anticipate the arrival of food after 10 seconds. The third step was the consolidation of food anticipation. Once the horse had learned to anticipate the arrival of food, it needed to repeat 5 consecutive trials, during which it had to anticipate the arrival of food by staying within 1 meter of the feeder. When the horse succeeded, it was considered ready to start the test. If not, the horse had to repeat a series again. Only 1 horse failed during this step and was excluded. Step 4. Beginning of the test. The frustration test was similar to the anticipation one, but after 10 seconds, the perpex panel was not removed. This was the beginning of the food frustration test, which finished when the subject was given access to the food 1 minute later. For the disappointment test, as the anticipation one, the horses had no access to food for the first 10 seconds. After this period, the opaque panel was closed and then the transparent perplex panel was then open, allowing the horse access to an empty feeder for 1 minute. We used the same experimental order as Vaintrub and colleagues. The horses were randomly but evenly allocated to one of two groups. So they started by the part 1 and then the part 2, or part 2 and then part 1. In bold, we have the period when the measurements have been taken. For each horse, 9 3-second samples of video were extracted to be used for Equifax coding. 3 for anticipation, 3 for frustration, and 3 for disappointment situations. The starting point of this sample was randomly selected. The criteria for considering a sample as valid were that the horse was within 1 meter from the feeder and that it was visible for at least 2 seconds. If these criteria were not met, then another random starting point was generated. At the end, 296 video samples met the criteria and were created. An example of video sample for the anticipation. Here for the frustration, and here for the disappointment. All the video samples were coded by a certified Equifax coder based on the Equifax manual. In this 3-second sample of video, all actions were coded as present or absent using 1-0 sampling method. For the analysis, we only use Equifax variable with a prevalence of more than 10% in one of the 3 situations: anticipation, frustration, and disappointment. Variable in bold. So here we have the variable for the ears area, the eyes area, and the nose area. Here we have the variable for the mouth area. On the left we have the hand movement, and on the right we have the behaviors. And we added 2 variables which were not present on the Equifax manual, licking and biting the feeder. In order to ensure the reliability of the coding, a second certified Equifax coder coded 30 video samples, that is to say more than 10% of the video sample created. So these video samples were randomly selected and renamed so that the second coder was blind to the condition. And the level of agreement between the two coders was calculated for the 28 variable with a prevalence above 10% using Cohen-Kappa coefficient of concordance. So only the variable with a strength of agreement of at least substantial were kept in the following analysis. Only 6 variables had an agreement between coders below substantial: inner brow raiser, upper lid raiser, ear adductor, nostril dilator, tilt left, and nose forward. Consequently, these variables were not kept in the following analysis. As no effect of repeated measurements and group order were found in the initial analysis, the data from the different situations were pulled together. So we investigated the effect of situation on horse facial expression by performing a binomial mixed effect model. So the variable coded as 0 for absent and 1 for present were used as the responses. The situation, anticipation, frustration, and disappointment as fixed factors, and the subject identity as a random factor. For the disappointment phase, as most of the time the lower face of the horse was not visible because in the feeder box, the following variables were not analyzed only for this situation. Now we will see the effect of situation on horse facial expression and behavior. So due to the time limit, I will only focus on the significant results. So here for the ears area, ear rotator was more likely during the anticipation and frustration situation than the disappointment one. For the eyes area, we can see that blink was more likely to occur in the disappointment situation than the frustration one, and eye white increase were more likely during the anticipation and frustration situation than the disappointment one. Ear, nostril lift, and tongue show were more likely in the disappointment situation than the 2 other ones. For the behaviors, chewing and licking feeder were more likely to occur during the disappointment situation than during the anticipation and frustration ones. Moreover, the variable biting feeder was more likely in the frustration situation than the disappointment one. Now the head movement. As you can see, head down left was more likely to occur during the anticipation and frustration situation than the disappointment one. So I would like to start by my second hypothesis, which was that horse facial expression will also differ between the two negative emotional states, disappointment and frustration. So we found that 9 facial expression and behavior out of 22 vary significantly between the two situations. So the frustration was characterized by a higher occurrence of eye white increase, ear rotator, head down left, and biting feeder compared to the disappointment situation. As the opposite, blink, nostril lift, tongue show, showing, and licking feeder were more likely in the disappointment situation than the frustration one. Our first hypothesis was that horse facial expression will differ between positive and negative valence. So in this study, we found no difference in facial expression between the anticipation and frustration situation, contrary to what was found by Bremhorst and colleagues in dogs. So several possibilities can explain our result. So firstly, it is possible that some facial movement and behavior are associated to these two emotions. For example, in horses, bowing is associated with anticipation as well as frustration. So it is possible that anticipation and frustration differ in terms of frequency. Secondly, it was a preliminary research and our focus was on facial movements and behavior related to the head area. So perhaps it was not enough to highlight the difference between these two emotions, and other behavioral and physiological measurements are needed, such as locomotion activity, heart rate, and so on. So for example, we notice that some horses bowing or turn in circles in the loose box. Thus, this more overt behavioral expression might be more relevant for recognizing frustration than facial expression. Another possibility is that the anticipation and frustration situations didn't elicit the emotional valence expected, that is to say a positive valence for the anticipation and a negative one for the frustration. It is possible that during the anticipation period, the positive emotion of waiting for access to the food turns into frustration. However, in order to prevent this change of emotional valence to happen, the horses were trained to wait for the reward for 10 seconds. So it is possible that in general, the feeding period is not perceived as a positive event in horses as they have no control over the situation. That is to say, they cannot control when they will have access to the food as they are fed when the human decide to do so. The fact that in our experiment the horses know that the food has arrived in the feeder but cannot access it because of the transparent perpex panel may have induced frustration. For example, waiting or delaying feeding period in horses can induce a frustration behaviors and increase stereotypic behavior before the food arrives. This result raises the important question as to whether the pre-feeding period is a positive event for horses, but also given the environment in which horses live in the wild, is excited anticipation an unlikely state experienced in this species. I would like to say thank you to Professor Daniel Mills, Nicolas Joly, the Amrad Emerald, and my founder, the Horse Trust. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Claire. That's a really fascinating study. Must have been quite frustrating for you to do as well, though. If you turn your camera on now, we can pass some questions on to you. So there's one here from Maha Yousfi. Is facial analysis for horses affected by age, and can significant results be obtained when analysing the expressions of young horses?
So here we didn't investigate the effect of age, but I think yes, it is possible that we can find an effect. But here it was impossible because the horse were between 2 and 23 years old.
Okay, thanks. So quite a range.
Yeah.
One from Steve Wickens. Although a social animal, horses are also a prey species. Should we perhaps not be surprised that anticipation and frustration can't be distinguished, unlike a social species like a dog that are highly visual?
I'm not totally sure about it. I think it's more that when we speak about positive anticipation in horses, it's more if we think in the wild species what they will anticipate food. in the wild, it's more something due to the human management, I'd say.
Right, thank you. Another one from Steve Wickens there. As the comparison was made on two negative valence emotions, the difference was relative to arousal. Have you made comparisons between different valences? Well, I guess that's, you know,
Sorry, could you repeat?
Have you made comparisons between different valences using this method?
Here we were thinking that the frustration will be of high valence compared to the disappointment, which will be of low valence. So we investigate the difference between the two, but I think that if we would continue, it will be to measure also the heart rate of the horse to be sure of the balance of the situation.
And do you think that there's any chance of differentiating high valence emotions, so differentiating frustration from pain, for instance? Would you expect those to have different facial expressions as well?
Yes, I think. Yeah, I think it is possible, but I think, yes, we need to also, if we really want to speak about valence, I think that we cannot only use the facial expression, and perhaps we also need to have like physiological measurements.
Absolutely. Okay, one last question from Mathilde Stomp. As you said at the end that maybe the anticipation of food is not really a positive situation, do you have any idea of other positive situations that could be tested?
No, at the moment, yes, it was a bit at the end of the study. What would be a positive anticipation for us? So yes, it's a question that we have in mind for future research, but thanks for the question.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting. And actually, there's a related one that's just come in from Siobhan Abisinga. Have you considered trying to use a reward stimulus that a horse might be more likely to anticipate? So I guess, what do we think is a naturally rewarding stimulus in the horse's environment?
Like food, another food treat, something like that?
Okay, so
because here it was, yes, here everything was related to food. So if we really want to speak about facial expression of frustration, we need to test the horses in another context without not related to the food.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. That was a great talk. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you.
Okay, so we will move on to our next talk. As usual with UFAW conferences, switching species at incredibly high frequency, we're going to be talking about sustainability and higher welfare chicken production. And welcome to Liam Hodgson from the Humane League.
Hello everyone. Firstly, thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Liam Hodgson. I am the Global Animal Welfare Specialist for chickens, more specifically broilers for the Humane League. And today I'm going to talk about sustainability in higher welfare chicken production. So the Humane League, just to provide a bit of context, we are an animal welfare NGO who exists to end the abuse of animals raised for food. So what this means is we are actively working towards getting the minimum welfare standards of animals raised for food raised to an acceptable level. Quite often when we discuss sustainable development and high welfare systems, the first thing that's mentioned is the requirement of slower growing breeds, which grow slower and live longer and therefore require more feed. And while this technically is true, there are so many other factors that impact sustainability as well that we need to actively address all of them to get more of an accurate representation of how sustainable these systems are. So when I talk about high welfare systems, I'm referring specifically to the Better Chicken Commitment, the BCC. This is also known as the European Chicken Commitment, the ECC. There are also other regions, the US and New Zealand, that have their own BCC as well. However, the welfare requirements are exactly the same within all of these. So I may use the terms BCC and ECC interchangeably. They all require slower growing breeds, lower stocking densities, and the adoption of controlled atmosphere stunning. So if we look at sustainability and the BCC, these factors at the top are things that are immediately improved with regards to the BCC. In the middle are factors that are improved in some ways, but may not be in others. And finally, there are some indirect factors that are of no relevance to the BCC directly. However, I strongly recommend these are still addressed when looking at improving sustainability overall. So firstly, I'm going to talk about mortality. And the reason being, in the UK in 2021, 64 million birds died before slaughter. In the US in 2022, this figure is over 487 million. So collectively in these two regions alone, that is more than 500 million birds. So it's worth noting that these are birds that still required feed, space, water, still contributed to the overall environmental footprint, but never actually made it to the supermarket shelf that they were intended for. So this currently is not sustainable. If we look at the mortality differences between faster and slower growing breeds, it is immediately evident that slower growing breeds are more sustainable because fewer birds need to be reared overall. So if we look at this study by Rayner that shows the mortality rate of a slower growing breed as 2.58% and the faster growing breed 6.23%, in the context of rearing 1 million birds. So farmers currently know and understand mortality rates of their flocks, which means they actively place more birds than what they need purely to compensate for this loss. So with this in mind, with these mortality rates, you would need 36,500 more fast growing birds to end up with the same amount of birds at the end of the production cycle. So the slower growing breed means fewer birds needed, which means an increase in sustainability. Next, I want to talk about myopathies, so muscular myopathies specifically. I'm going to address white striping and wooden breast only because these are the two most common myopathies that we see in broiler production. So the reason these are important is because during the processing stage in the processing plant, when these myopathies are identified, quite often the meat will either be downgraded or it will be condemned if the condition is severe enough. So not only is there a financial loss when these myopathies are identified, but it also means that you will then need more birds to end up with the correct amount of quality meat that you needed at the end. We also know that the biggest risk factors associated with these myopathies is the faster growth rate. So Dixon directly compared a slower growing breed, which is the JA757, to the three most commonly used faster growing conventional breeds, which is the Ross 308, the Cobb 500 and the Hubbard Flex. So white striping and wooden breast in the slower growing breed was 9% and 0.9% respectively, whereas in the faster growing breeds, these were up to 78% in white striping and 23.4% wooden breast. So this is a significant difference. So using a slower growing breed means that you'll have fewer of these myopathies, which ultimately should lead to fewer downgrades and fewer condemnations of meat. Next, I wanted to address antibiotics. So quite often when we look at sustainability and animal welfare production systems, antibiotic usage is overlooked. When antibiotics have such an influence on not only human health, but the future of human medicine, I think it's critical that they are also addressed when we look at sustainability in animal welfare production. So in the current climate, the Food Standards Agency within the UK found that 60.6% of Campylobacter taken directly from retail chickens contain tetracycline resistance. And the reason this is so alarming is because tetracyclines are one of two classes of antibiotics that are still most commonly given to broilers, meaning that without a reduction in antibiotic usage, this resistance is only likely to get worse. On a more global scale, E. coli in broilers was found to have above 40%, or above 40% of all samples, should I say, showed resistance to 4 different classes of antibiotics across all of these countries. So that's aminoglycosides, sulfonamides, penicillins, and tetracyclines, with, of course, the exception of ampicillin resistance within the US. So this just shows that antibiotic resistance is in fact a global issue and one that could be improved by the adoption of a slower growing breed. This is because faster growing breeds in general use 3 to 5 times more antibiotics than slower growing breeds do. And of course, the more antibiotics that are used, the more likely resistance is to develop. Also, another study found that faster growing breeds use almost 6.7 times more critically important antibiotics. So these are antibiotics that are classed as critically important within human medicine, purely because they are often only used as a last resort due to resistance that has already developed with regards to this class of antibiotics. Next, I want to talk about water usage and slaughter. So currently conventional systems use the electric water bath, and the BCC requires the adoption of controlled atmosphere stunning. So the electric water bath system uses almost 3 times more water per day than what a cast system does. So if we put this into context, for one slaughterhouse with an average of 12,000 birds per hour capacity running for most of the year, they could save almost 2 million litres of water just from making this switch alone. On an even larger scale, in 2019 in the US, only 5.5% of their slaughterhouses actually used cast systems. If all of these remaining slaughterhouses switched to from their electric water bath to a cast system, this would save collectively around 450 million litres of water every single year, just from this one switch alone. Finally, I want to talk about feed, as this is often one of the most controversial points, as I previously mentioned in my introduction. So feed has 2 contributions to the environmental footprint, which is the greenhouse gas emissions, but it also has land use change emissions as well. There are a lot of misconceptions with regards to broiler feed and broiler breeds. So quite often people believe that a faster growing conventional breed, their feed requirements would be exactly the same in a high welfare, slower growing breed, when this is not the case at all. So a slower growing breed, because it doesn't need such a energy dense diet, can actually thrive on a lower protein diet, meaning that it doesn't actually need as much soya overall. A recent Dutch study compared 3 different production systems and actually actively looked at the emissions that they generated. So these systems were conventional, Dutch retail broiler, which is better than conventional, but it doesn't quite meet the standards of BCC, and Better Life 1 Star, which not only meets the BCC, but actually exceeds it in some areas as well. So as you can see, looking through the whole production cycle, so from the rearing period right through to the broiler farm, the high welfare systems consistently had lower emissions overall than the conventional system. And this is for the reasons that I previously mentioned. So lower mortality rates, lower soya requirements, etc. The study also predicts that a switch from conventional to Better Life 1 Star system would actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2.9%. Finally, to provide some context to all of this, I want to go through a real-life case study of how sustainability and animal welfare work together in the real world in commercial production. So this is Norsk Chilling. They are a Norwegian supplier. They hold approximately 27% of the total market share in Norway. So they are not the biggest supplier in the world, but they are also not a small supplier either. They committed to the ECC in 2020 and had fulfilled the requirements by spring 2022. So the reason I've looked at Norsk Chilling specifically is because they have some extremely ambitious goals. So this is to reduce total carbon emissions by 51% by 2030 and to be 100% soya free within their feed by 2030. And this would make them completely climate neutral. And the thing that I like most about this is that they are taking a holistic approach that actually puts animal welfare first. So how is it going so far? So on farm, it's important to realize that they've actually increased their farm space by 28%. But at the same time, they've still managed to reduce their carbon footprint by 21%. They also recently developed a new processing plant, which is already 100% climate neutral compared to their previous plant. Alongside the BCC work they're doing, they also run a lot of other projects as well, such as the planting of flower meadows to preserve biodiversity, the development of biogas trucks to make environmentally friendly transport, looking at how they can develop their own chicken waste into biogas, plus lots of other things as well, which again reiterates my previous point that sustainability needs to be holistic with multiple aspects addressed. So what this means is that between 2019 and 2021, they actually reduced their Scope 1 emissions by 26% and their Scope 2 emissions by 53%. In this time, their Scope 3 emissions did actually increase by 3%. And while this may seem alarming at first, because of course Scope 3 includes the feed, which is obviously the biggest contributor to the overall environmental footprint, the National Farmers Union actually predicted that switching to a BCC system compared to a conventional system would result in a 22 to 23% increase in emissions. So the fact that North Chilean are not only still right at the beginning of their sustainability journey, they've only increased their emissions by 3%. I think this is actually extremely positive, and they are only going to continue to improve over time. So just to summarize, by switching to a slower growing breed, which is obviously one of the requirements of the BCC, their mortality rates were significantly lower. What this means is that their average daily mortality rate is now 40% lower than their whole national average. They also directly compared the environmental footprint of the two breeds and found that by switching from their previous faster growing breed to their new slower growing breed, that it was actually 1% more efficient. And again, this is for the reasons that I've mentioned previously. So lower mortality rates, fewer muscular myopathies, less soy requirements in the diet, etc. So through switching to the BCC and also the some of the other initiatives which I mentioned as well, this means that North Chile now rear 3 million fewer birds every single year, but still produce the exact same amount of meat. So what they've done is they have increased sustainability and they've increased animal welfare together. If there's anything that you take away from this presentation, I want it to be that the BCC is not unsustainable as it has previously been perceived, and that sustainability and animal welfare can actually thrive together. Please do feel free to get in touch with me anytime with any questions, or if you just want to know any more. And again, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Liam. If you could switch your camera on, there we go. We can put a few questions across. There's two or three about the slaughter method, and I was going to ask this too. You talked about obviously a reduction in water, switching to controlled atmosphere, which is going to be, I presume, carbon dioxide stunning. There are going to be environmental consequences of using carbon dioxide, although it's a byproduct in many cases. It still has to be compressed and moved to the slaughter plant, and there'll be energy and greenhouse gas emission consequences from that. So have you compared those two?
I mean, there's always going to be trade-offs because that's just the nature of how the production works. While the majority of the cast systems used are carbon dioxide, I personally would recommend a monophasic system which uses inert gas such as nitrogen or argon, so that will have a different impact on the environmental footprint as well. With regards to the question we asked, I've not managed to actually find any studies that do directly compare that, and that's something that I have looked into. So if anyone does know anything, please do pass it on.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I think there may well be some slightly interesting results to be had there. There's a couple of questions also just asking, what are the barriers to getting farmers to switch to the BCC?
I mean, it's a very difficult question because obviously the farmers produce what the suppliers want them to produce, and the suppliers are sort of restricted in what the retailers want them to produce. So in the UK in particular, the retailers hold around 70% of the whole market, which means that they almost have the biggest say. So there has been interviews and research into farmers that have recently switched to the BCC because M&S have recently signed up and already are implementing the BCC, and there is a lot of sort of positive attitudes towards it. They feel more comfortable producing high welfare breeds. They feel like the overall system is better and healthier, and the welfare is improved for the birds, which obviously affects the mental health and the overall atmosphere on the farms for the staff as well. But like I say, it all comes down to the biggest players in the game to make those switches for it to happen. Unfortunately, so those are the people that we're working with to try and make these changes.
Okay, thanks. A technical question here. Paul Rose wanted to know if you could explain what white stripe and wooden breast are and how they're caused, because he hasn't heard those terms before.
Yeah, of course. So they're both muscular myopathies. So essentially, it's just necrosis of the muscle tissue. So because these breeds grow so big so quickly, their breasts grow a lot quicker than what their body can physically make them grow, if that makes sense. So the muscular tissue actually goes through various stages of breaking down and rebuilding and breaking down and rebuilding. And in the case of white striping, this means that fatty white strips will actually be produced within the breast to make up for the inability to grow so quickly. And it's very similar with wooden breast, but this is more like fibrous tissue which builds up inside the breasts, which creates like hard patches. So specifically with wooden breast, when that is found within factories in the processing plants, that meat, rather than going to fresh wholesale, would get downgraded into like chicken nuggets and other processed meats where it's not going to be noticed as much. But again, that has the financial impact because it's further processing, so you lose money on the meat.
And would they be indicative of any welfare issues, the existence of those within?
Yes, certainly. So these conditions, like I say, it's a breakdown and build up of the muscles. So these are painful conditions for the birds.
Okay, thank you very much. And one last one I'm going to squeeze in from Amelia Garcia Ara. How long would it take for a farmer in the UK to go from fast to slow growing breeds? Do they need to change the supplier of the chicks, or are there any other changes needed on the farm? Would supermarkets need to pay more and charge more?
It all depends on how many birds they are producing. So there are, Hubbard is the main breeder now that provides slow growing breeds. So they do have grandparent flocks and parent flocks on the ground, so they can provide a certain number of slower growing breeds straight away. If it was a significant order, obviously then they have to place more grandparent flocks and parent flocks. So it could be a process of up to 2 years, for example, for an extremely large production. With regards to the finances, that has been one of the barriers with us getting people to adopt the BCC because they believe there'll be a financial increase. Initially, yes, it possibly would be, but with anything with a significant shift in the market and the majority of production changing, this will naturally drive the price down. And then again, M&S, when they launched and brought out their BCC birds, they didn't have a price increase for the consumers. North Chilean, the case study I spoke about, so they are owned by Rima 1000 in Norway, who are a budget retailer and they provide all of their chicken. They had no price increases when they started providing it either. So I'm not saying that there won't be price increases, but I don't think it's as bad as what it's perceived to be.
Okay, thank you. There are a lot of questions about price, so that's really interesting to cover that at the end. Thank you very much, Liam. And we'll move on now to our last talk of this session. So we're staying with birds, but we're talking about welfare implications of breed and release practice for hunted bird species. Case study from Central Italy, and welcome to Michael Odinstov Vaintrub.
Hi, my name is Michael Odinstov, and aside of being a veterinarian in Central Italy, I'm also a master's student in forestry. And today I want to talk about welfare implications of breed and release practice for hunted bird species. especially from the point of view of animal welfare and adaptation to the wild. So just a quick review about hunting and bird hunting in Italy before we start. Hunting in Italy is defined by national law, lastly updated in 1992, and the number of hunters is in decline for about 30 years now. Since its peak in the 80s, it's now reduced to about 600,000 across Italy, of which more than 25% are pensioners with an average age of 60. But they do have a really strong identity and cultural affiliation to it. Bird hunting amounts to about 50% of the total of hunting in Italy, both in terms of species and as a game bank, so how many animals are shot, and is usually practiced in open fields, so on farmland or wetland. And from the legal standpoint, farmland, private land of the farmer, can be accessed by the hunter even without permission or notification of the hunter. Just as a side note, for the popularity of bird hunting, the English setter is the most commonly bred dog in Italy even today. The breed and release practice is a historically established one, and since the 80s it grew in its importance because the demand for hunting exceeded the natural population of the birds in Italy. Especially with the collapse of certain populations, the dependency on the breed and release program was the basis for most of the hunting in the area. The first of the two key species of interest is the grey partridge. It's a relatively small bird, which was really widespread across Europe because it was very adapted to the hedges and the limits between small-scale farms. However, since the 1950s to 80s, with the transition to mechanized agriculture, the population collapsed significantly, with the hunting pressure decreasing. So the current situation of the grey partridge is that the vast majority of the birds hunted are released, and there is only limited number of nuclears actively reproducing in the northern parts of Italy. As you can see, since the 80s, started a national demand for both wild birds and eggs coming from abroad to maintain the activity of the hunters. The second significant bird species is the common pheasant, which is the bigger and the more prized from the hunter point of view cousin of the grey partridge. Historically, again, it's an animal that was present in Europe, but it's more adaptable to forests and groves, and the population didn't suffer so much from the passage from mechanized agriculture. However, in the recent years, the pressure of hunting, because this is a bird specifically hunted and prized, did have a significant impact, and the wild population is in decline in recent about 10 years. The current work was comprised of three different components. The first was the documentation analysis for regional plans for hunting management, as well as the legislation relevant to this specific area. The second part was comprised of farm visits, so to see both the facilities and release sites, as well as an observation site for long-term permanence of the birds in the wild. And finally, interviews that were semi-structured and involved in opening questions, probing, and alternative viewpoints questions to better understand the view of the different actors in this specific area. Starting with the grey partridge, we had documentation going back to 2008. However, it wasn't complete, neither from geographically, neither from hunting bag reports. So we did have reports of releasing, but we didn't have reports of hunting, or we did have reports for hunting, but not from releasing. The only complete years were between 2015 and 17, for which we have a complete view of what was going on, and we had almost 10,000 birds released overall, and a hunting activity that had a very low efficiency. The peak area was about 40% hunting, leaving more than 80 or even 90% of the animals free in the wild. We have a similar trend with the common pheasant, again with data available from 2015 to 2017. The only difference is the popularity of the pheasant as a hunting species, so the numbers were more than double, of overall hunting, and the hunting efficiency was higher. But even here again, the top efficiency was about 40% of the hunted, leaving 60% of the birds in the wild again. From the regional perspective, there was no specific correlation between the areas, and the released numbers were not distributed equally. Some provinces has much higher numbers than the rest. However, I do suspect of a bias in reporting, because I personally visit both sites and farms in Teramo province that were not reported here. We also didn't find any correlation between the numbers of the birds released and the numbers of the hunted birds, neither the correlation with the releases of the following year, which implies that there is no logical process in establishing the releasing numbers or the hunting activity for a given area. Speaking about the welfare consideration, and especially the legal standpoint of welfare, the breed to release falls in between two different sets of legislations. While the animals on the farm, from the welfare standpoint, they are covered by the Animal Welfare Act, which is national law, but also the European regulation that's related to farm management, poultry, disease, and all the controls that in place for farming. However, while birds or other animals, when they go out from the farm, they're now under the legal cover of the transporter of animals or the abattoir. In the case of breed to release, they covered by the law of hunting. So it's the consolidated hunting law in Italy, which was updated in '92. And this law doesn't define the animals as individual or attribute specific responsibility. By this law, all wildlife, and in this case released wildlife, is the property of the state. And even when it's done on private land, it's still considered not the property of the specific farmer. The only exception to this are game reserve farms, which are not found in the Abruzzo region or much to the north. So this legal situation actually puts the birds in what is defined the tragedy of the commons. The farmer is no longer responsible, the landowner is not responsible, and the hunter is responsible for the hunting procedure, so how he shoots, what ammunition he uses, and how many times a year he shoots, but is not responsible for the welfare and life quality of the birds in the wild. So just to dissect a little bit the process of breeding and releasing, and again from the welfare standpoint, the first stage of the breeding is of course the rearing, so where the birds are grown from eggs from incubation until adulthood. And as you can see, there is a huge variety, and it's done both by specialized farms, so farms specialized in game birds. It's done by part-time farmers, so farmers that contracted periodically and have the facilities, as you can see in the center, but it's not the main activity on the farm. Or even in the case of the partridge, because there is a national attempt to repopulate, on the right side you can see the National Forester Farm. And again, there is a big variety in the living condition and the standards of production. Paradoxically, game farms try to promote their view, they put it on Facebook, they market themselves, and they try to adhere to high standards of naturality. So you will see them plant crops to provide shade and cover and more natural environment for the animals. But it's not necessary. It's on the design, the farmer himself can decide it. The adaptation, which is maybe the most important part, it's a regional requirement. So this is a mitigation strategy where the birds can be released, at least partially, to adapt to movement. And again, this is not a standardized procedure. It can be done in individual cages, or at least big enough cages, or a big area. And this is a legislation that is part of the regional attempt to make the release process more smooth for the bird. As you can see, it's a significant effort for the farmer because the rearing area in size is just a fraction from the adaptation area, where they need to stay at least a couple of weeks before releasing. The release and harvesting stage is the part that's done outside of the farm, where the hunting association or the subcontractor that bought the birds originally comes and transport and release the birds in the hunting sites. Usually it is done a couple of days to a couple of weeks before the official season, so then the hunters can come back to the same area and practice their activity. The post-season is the time frame related to the animals who survived the hunting activity, the same 60 to 90% of the total birds that now remain in the area for the rest of the year. And from a welfare perspective, this is the most critical period because these birds are not adjusted to wildlife. They don't present behaviors of flightness or roosting, and you can frequently see them outside in the open fields without flight behavior associated to wild animals. As a result, it's safe to assume most of these of this nucleus do not stay in the area and have a very high percentage of mortality. This is further supported by the next year release, because if the population would have stayed, hunters would not want to release and invest again in the same process. We observed some deviation from the mentioned rule during our long-term observations, especially in the Conner National Park, which is a wooded and forested area of a national protected farm, where hunting is not allowed. However, populations of birds that released around the park trickle in and do establish a long-term nucleus. As you can see in the two photos, we are in March, and this is already post-winter and post-hunting season, and we can find in the hedges both male and female in the same proximity moving together. However, I would say this is an exception related to the fact that the forest and the undergrowth is very intense, and there is no hunting pressure from humans. However, there are present wolves and foxes in the area. The key observation from the current work include the identification of breed and release practice as a distinct part of a niche activity in the hunting process, and it sits on the crossroads between the hunting and farming. It also lacks a legal framework to cover the entire life cycle of the animals, and while the process is widely adopted and recognized, the data collection is very limited and partial. And this leads to high mortality rates, especially in the post-release period, with significant numbers of the raised and released animals probably dying during the winter before the next year's season of hunting. This highlights the fact that this field needs a much better precise data collection, especially regarding numbers of animals and trends in the area. Also, observational studies regarding adaptation patterns of animals that do stay and the nucleus that do remain in the wild active after the release, and definition of animal welfare parameters for such hunting practices. In conclusion, the rearing, releasing, hunting, and reporting of game bird population suffers from a significant underreporting and lack of consistent data. Improving the registry and the traceability of such processes are initial key steps to quantify the related animal welfare issues as a baseline for future policies or wider discussion. I would like to thank to all who took part and helped us with this project, from giving us access to official registries, to tracking of animals in the wild, and showing us around the farm. It all was done with an impressive spirit of transparency and overall acceptance of the work. And of course, thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. If you can switch your camera on, we'll relay a few questions for you. Hi, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I've got one there from Elina Asbier, who says they have the same system in Sweden with negative consequences for captive birds and wild birds. The survival rate after releasing the birds is very poor. Genetic changes have been seen in the bred animals which pose a risk for wild animals, etc. Do you have any requirements on how to adapt and prepare animals before releasing them, or requirements regarding feeding in the wild, etc.?
So there is a regional legislation that I mentioned briefly, which requires the animals to be pre-released to a confined area with significant movement space. But beside of this, there is not much work, and I don't think there is a body now in the area that tracks the behavior or the adaptation in a systematic manner. I do think that it's a widespread problem, and again, it would be interesting to do exactly this type of studies to give this answer. This is my first dip of the toe in the pool, so I hope to keep doing this work.
Plenty more to do. Good to hear. A question from Beate Nielsen. If they survive the winter, why is the release number so consistent year after year? Is that part of the business model?
Some of them survive. What I presented as the corner on national park is the exception that confirms the norm. So it's a national park with a lot of forests, and the hunting is prohibited. And in this specific context, some groups survive. In the rest of the area, where they release it in farming areas, where there is no cover and there is no adaptation and the hunting is allowed, they don't survive. And this way they release every year consistent numbers. I didn't draw the yearly, but for example, some areas release every year about 500 pheasants. So a yearly release of the same number implicates that there is no survival afterwards.
So the wild population isn't growing year on year, essentially.
No, the effect of these practices on the wild nucleus is minimal. So the same wild nucleus that were present 20 years ago, they're still present today, and they're not expanding. So this is a self-consuming process that is independent of the wildlife population.
Okay, thank you. Interesting. Another question on mortality from Steve Wickens. How do mortality rates compare for birds whilst being reared post-release due to hunting and mortality due to environmental factors and predation?
Ooh, I wish I would have had this data. We were talking about tagging the birds when they released. So once they hunted, we can identify the year of release and see if they survive longer without the hunting pressure. But I haven't found a study that done it. And again, I hope next year to bring some more concrete data telling you what is the percentage of hunting and what is the percentage of nature. I would say based on the low efficiency of hunting, that nature, so predators, cold and lack of food are the main reasons, but this is an estimation. It's not a clear definition.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks. It sounds like you've got lots of interesting work to do over the next few years. So thank you very much for a really interesting talk. We're just about up on our time for a coffee break now. So thanks, Michael, and thanks to all the other speakers in this first session. It's been really fascinating. We're going to go and grab a quick coffee break, and we'll resume at 12:20. So this session will close. If you click on the same link you used to come to this session, you should reopen in GoToWebinar at 12:20. So we'll see you soon for session 2. Thanks very much, everyone.